Cockpits opened to find personal items, artifacts, and mummified pilots still in their seats. From passenger jets sitting in deserts to warplanes and glaciers, these are disturbing discoveries found inside abandoned aircraft. Ceta Flight 011 was a passenger plane flying with Ecuador. On August 15, 1976, it left Quito with 55 people on board, but somewhere over the Andes, the plane vanished. There's no distress call, no debris found at the time. Search teams struggled with the terrain and the weather, and after years of failed attempts to find it, the case went cold. But that changed in October of 2002 when mountaineers noticed metal sticking out of the ice. When investigators reached the site, they confirmed it was Flight 11. The wreckage was spread across the glacier, and inside and around it were human remains, almost perfectly preserved by the cold. They also found personal belongings, identification papers, and newspapers dated the day the plane disappeared. The plane had hit the mountain at cruising speed, breaking apart on impact before being buried by snow and ice. Over time, the glacier slowly moved the wreckage back toward the surface, which is why it took more than 2 decades to be found. On August 2, 1947, a British South American Airways plane called Stardust was flying from Buenos Aires to Santiago with 11 people on board. Everything seemed normal until just minutes before landing. Final radio transmission was a strange Morse code word sent twice, Stendek. After that, the plane just disappeared. For over 50 years, no wreckage was found. But then in 1998, debris started showing up thanks to melting ice in the Andes. Climbers dug up engine parts, sections of fuselage and luggage, and over the next few years, the glacier released something far more disturbing: human remains. Among what was found were 3 torsos, a foot still inside a boot, and a nearly perfectly preserved severed hand. The remains started showing up as the glacier moved downhill, rather than appearing all at once. They were able to identify some of the victims through DNA testing, including the radio operator. Investigators eventually concluded the pilots misjudged their position, hit the mountain, and were instantly buried by snow and ice. On February 7, 1968, an Indian Air Force transport plane disappeared while flying from Chandigarh to Leh. There were 102 people on this plane, including crew members and military. The last signal came from a remote mountain area in northern India, and then nothing. The plane was eventually declared missing, but in 2003, a group of mountaineers came across aircraft debris and the body of a soldier. The remains was still clothed, with documents and money still in the pockets. This confirmed the crash site after more than 3 decades. Since then, the Indian Army has launched multiple recovery missions as ice continues to melt. Teams have found engines, cockpit components, fuselage fragments, and more human remains. In 2019, another body was found, and then 4 more in 2024, but the wreckage is scattered across a wide glacial area, so recovery has been slow. But each time the glacier shifts, new debris is exposed, and they think more remains and aircraft parts are still embedded in the ice. In February 1942, a U.S. Air Force's bomber aircraft ran out of fuel during a mission over Papua New Guinea. Crew managed to land in a remote swamp. Everyone survived and was able to leave the area, but the plane was a write-off, so it sat in the swamp for decades. When it was rediscovered in 1972, though, it was still mostly intact. The cockpit still had all its levers, dials, and switches. The radios were sitting where they'd been, and panels and instruments were still attached. Even parts of the wings and fuselage were mostly intact. But because the swamp was so isolated, nobody had stripped it or taken parts away, the way it usually happens with abandoned planes. People started photographing it and documenting it over the years, and the plane earned the nickname Swamp Ghost. But when salvage teams finally got to it in 2006, they shipped it back to the U.S. In July 1942, a group of American planes was flying from the U.S. to Europe when they ran into a massive storm over Greenland. There were 6 small twin-engine fighter planes and 2 large 4-engine bombers in the group. The weather was brutal, with low visibility, very strong winds, and endless ice below, and the pilots just had no choice but to land on the frozen ice sheet. Fortunately, though, everyone made it out alive, but the planes were left behind, eventually buried by layers of snow. Over the next 50 years, snowfall kept piling up, eventually covering the aircraft under more than 260 feet of ice. By the time anyone even knew roughly where to look, the planes were trapped in a frozen mountain of ice. In 1992, a team finally located one of the fighters, later nicknamed Glacier Girl, using radar that could see through the ice. Getting her out was a massive operation, though. Engineers had to drill a vertical shaft straight down to the plane and then carefully cut into sections sections to lift it out safely. Once the sections were freed, the interior was surprisingly well preserved. The cockpit still had all the switches, dials, and gauges, and seats. Panels were basically intact. There were even small things like notes and logbooks that had survived frozen in the ice. After years of careful work, the fighter was rebuilt and eventually flew again in 2002, more than 60 years after it had been abandoned. In 1998, search teams in a remote area near Russia's Kola Peninsula came across the wreck of a Hawker Hurricane fighter aircraft. These planes were flown by Soviet pilots during World War II, after being supplied by Britain. Records later showed this aircraft had been shot down during combat in 1943. The fuselage was broken, but the cockpit area was still intact, and inside they found the pilot's body, still in the seat. His feet were still positioned near the pedals. Parts of his flight gear were still on him. The cold climate had slowed decomposition, which is why the remains were still there more than 50 years later. He was basically mummified. And they were able to identify the pilot and confirm which unit he flew with thanks to documents recovered from the site. Until that point, he'd been listed as missing in action. During World War II, American aircraft were flown to the Soviet Union through Alaska under the lend-lease program. The lend-lease program was how the US helped its allies during World War II by sending them weapons, vehicles, and aircraft. Well, one of those aircraft crashed in northern Russia sometime in the 40s, went down into a lake. For decades, no one knew exactly where it ended up, but in the early 2000s, search teams located the aircraft submerged beneath ice and water. Inside the cockpit were gauges, controls, wiring, and ammunition still in place. They also found personal items that belonged to the pilot, including paperwork and everyday supplies carried during long ferry flights. The pilot's remains were still inside the aircraft as well. Because the plane hit water, it wasn't torn apart in the crash or scavenged over time. It goes to show, though, just how dangerous these flights could be even when there was no enemy around. Eastern Airlines Flight 980 was a commercial Boeing 727 flying from Paraguay toward Miami, when on January 1st, 1985, it crashed into a glacier on Mount Limani in Bolivia. None of the 29 people on board survived, and for years the wreckage was buried under snow and ice and made any recovery almost impossible. For decades after the crash, only small fragments of the plane could be reached by search teams because the debris field was spread across a giant icy slope and buried under snow. And as the glacier began slowly shifting and melting, pieces of wreckage started to poke through the surface. Climbers eventually discovered bits of the aircraft scattered over a wide area, along with personal belongings from passengers. In 2016, a few pieces of the plane's flight recorder housing and small sections of wreckage were recovered from the ice. Some human remains have also been found among the debris on the mountain as the glacier continued churning up parts of the crash site. And this is a super recent case, well, a super recent update. The story actually starts in late December of 1943. A Royal Australian Air Force bomber was lost during a nighttime mission over Papua New Guinea. The Beaufort A9211 and its four-man crew disappeared into rugged jungle and mountain terrain, and nobody knew where the plane ended up for more than 8 decades. But in 2025, researchers finally confirmed the location of the wreckage in the remote Banning Mountains of New Britain Island. Parts of the aircraft were found spread across a steep slope, and investigators located original factory identification plates that proved exactly which plane this was. In the debris, they found aircraft controls, ammunition, and bits of parachute harnesses linked to the crew's gear. The 4 young airmen had been missing in action since 1943. And across the European Alps, old World War II planes keep showing up as glaciers melt. Most went down hard during missions and were buried almost immediately by snow, locking everything inside. But over the years, as the ice has shifted, pieces have been surfacing. Hikers and recovery teams have found chunks of fuselage, cockpit panels, seats, fabric, ammunition, and personal items the crew carried with them. And along with it, human remains. The weird thing is, it doesn't all appear at once. One year you might see a bent metal panel sticking out of the ice. A few years later, a seat or a wheel pops out further down the glacier. The ice slowly moves everything along. Some of the planes can be identified from serial numbers on the metal or small personal items, but a lot of sites are still only partially exposed. But every year, glaciers are still releasing new pieces of evidence bit by bit. Well, that's been the video for today. I will catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next one.